Okay, welcome to this segment 5 of Isaiah part 2. And if you would, you can take your Bibles and we will go to Isaiah chapter 47. Isaiah 47, and tonight I'll open with a word of prayer. So, Heavenly Father, I thank you for your goodness, grace, and your awesome power and your wisdom. It is so past finding out. God, I thank you for the truths of the Scripture, for those things that you revealed to the prophet Isaiah that we can be reading today over 2,000 years later, and that these truths still ring in our ears and in our hearts. And I ask you to open the eyes of our understanding tonight. Help us to comprehend more and more your will and what you would have us to know. So I thank you for this night in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So we're going to go to Isaiah 47. Chapters 47 and 48 we'll cover in this segment. And these are really a continuation of the context that we looked at in the last session over the last two segments, which covered chapters 40, the last four chapters. So these 6 chapters really all kind of cover the same topic, that of God's awesome ability to proclaim truths from long ago, Judah's idolatry, and the prophecies about Israel's captivity and then their deliverance from Babylon. So let's read through these 2 chapters. What I'd like to do is go through them. You're going to see many similarities to what we looked at last time. And then we'll take some time to consider these prophecies regarding Babylon. As this is the last time that we're going to look at tonight that Babylon is mentioned in the book of Isaiah. So I thought it would be good to take the time tonight to consider these prophecies about Babylon and its history and its future. 47, Isaiah 47:1. It says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no longer be called tender and delicate." Again, you see this Hebrew parallel here. You have come down and sit in the dust, virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, daughter of the Chaldeans. Chaldea is the southern region of this area of Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf. Oftentimes in the scriptures, Chaldea and Babylon are used interchangeably to describe this kingdom in this area of the world. The phrase daughter of Babylon, daughter of Chaldeans, it's simply a personification of Babylon and its inhabitants. When it's used, basically you're saying Babylon and the people of Babylon. Chaldea and the people of Chaldea. That's the simple understanding of what that means. And here, Babylon is told to sit on the ground in dust without a throne. This is a sign of mourning, the loss of power, loss of prestige. You're high and mighty. Now you're going to be humbled. Sit on the ground in the dust. And these 2 chapters are dealing with, again, the deliverance from Babylon. And let's simply read through these. Verse 2, "Take the millstones and grind meal. Remove your veil. Strip off the skirt. Uncover the leg. Cross the rivers. Your nakedness will be uncovered. Your shame also will be exposed. I will take vengeance and will not spare a man. Our Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. Sit silently and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you will no longer be called the queen of the kingdoms." Here, Babylon is called the queen of the kingdoms. And as we go through this tonight, this phrase of Babylon being the queen, well, you'll see as we go through this. "I was angry with my people. I profaned my heritage and gave them into your hand. You did not show mercy to them. On the aged you made your yoke very heavy. Yet you said, I will be a queen forever. Those things you did not consider, nor remember the outcome of them. Now then, hear this, you sensual one, who dwells securely, who says in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. I will not sit as a widow, nor know the loss of children. But these two things will come on you suddenly in one day: loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells. You felt secure in your wickedness and said, "No one sees me." Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you. For you said in your heart, "I am, and there is no one beside me." But evil will come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away, and disaster will fall on you, for which you cannot atone. And destruction about which you do not know will come on you suddenly. Stand fast now in your spells and in your sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to profit. Perhaps you may cause trembling. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars, those who predict by the new moons, let them stand up and save you from what will come upon you. Behold, they have become like stubble. Fire burns them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There will be no coal to warm by, nor a fire to sit before. So have those become to you with whom you have labored, who have trafficked or merchandised with you from your youth. Each has wandered in his own way. There is none to save you. Beautiful truths. And I just want to, as we go through this tonight, I want you to consider those things we just read. And maybe after we go through the things tonight, you want to go back and read this and consider these things. But I want to point out the queen here is Babylon, the daughter of Babylon. She is the queen of the kingdoms. And through this, it tells you really what the queen of Babylon does and how the queen of Babylon came to power. And I've written these in your notes. The queen had power through sensuality in verse 8. The queen received power through the use of sorceries and spells, magic practices, verse 9 and verse 12. Through wickedness, verse 10. Through wisdom and knowledge, in verse 10. Through her charm, verse 11. Through her counselors, her astrologers, her prophets and predictors, verse 13. And through trafficking or merchandising. This is how the queen utilized her power and seduced the kingdoms under her through these methods. Now let's go on to chapter 48. Hear this, O house of Jacob, who came from the loins of Judah. Now, what we're going to see here in these first 13 verses of chapter 48 is very similar to the chapters, what we saw in chapters 43 through 46 in the last segments. And that is that God is first and the last. He is the one who created all things. And before things take place, before these things took place, God declared them before they happened long ago. And his people, the house of Jacob and Israel, those who come from the house of Judah, they did not worship him in truth, but they were obstinate and put their trust in idols, in graven images. Again, it's almost like a broken record. Same things that we read the last segments, he's reiterating here. Verse 2, for they call themselves, the children of Israel, the children of Judah, they call themselves after the holy city, and lean on the God of Israel. Yahweh of hosts is his name. Verse 3. I declare the former things long ago, and they came forth from my mouth, and I proclaimed them. Suddenly I acted, and they came to pass. I proclaimed them, and when I acted, they came to pass. Because I know you are obstinate, and your neck is an iron sinew, and your forehead bronze. Therefore, I declared them to you long ago. Again, before they took place, I proclaimed them to you. Remember how many times God has repeated this to us here? So that you would not say, my idol has done them, my graven image, his molten image have commanded them. You have heard, look at all this. And you, will you not declare it? I proclaim to you new things from this time, even hidden things which you have not known. They are created now and not long ago. And before today you had not heard them, so that you will not say, behold, I knew them. I knew of that. You have not heard. You didn't know. You haven't known what I'm going to tell. Even from long ago your ear has not been opened, because I knew that you would deal very treacherously, and you have been called a rebel from birth. For the sake of my name, I delay my wrath. That's why has God delayed his wrath? For the sake of his name, for the name Yahweh. And for my praise I restrain it for you, in order not to cut off. Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction. For my own sake, there's one of those dual things. For my own sake, I will act. How can my name be profaned? And my glory I will not give to another. Listen to me, O Jacob, even Israel whom I called. I am he. I am the first. I also am the last. Surely my hand founded the earth, and my right hand spread out the heavens. There's again a dualism. When I call to them, they stand together. Now he goes on about Babylon. Assemble all you and listen. Who among them has declared these things? The Lord loves him. He will carry out his good pleasure on Babylon, and his arm will be against the Chaldeans. I, even I, have spoken. Indeed, I have called him. I have brought him, and he will make his ways successful. This is again one of these prophecies about the one who is going to carry out God's will to bring the deliverance to God's people. God will carry out his good pleasure on Babylon. Here in verse 15 it says God has called him. He's called him. And he will make his way successful. Once again in the scriptures they are ambiguous. It's an ambiguous reference to the one that will bring deliverance from Babylon. In the past chapters looked at last week, there are definite references to Cyrus, the Persian, who will defeat the Babylonians. Cyrus he had called, and he was named in the last chapter. Here again, it talks about him. However, I think the ambiguity here leaves open the possibility of another who will deliver God's people from Babylon. It can be Cyrus, but also it could be another him that's going to come that will bring the deliverance. Just is cool stuff. Verse 16. Come near to me. Listen to this. From the first I have not spoken in secret. From the time it took place, I was there. And now the Lord Yahweh has sent me in his spirit. Thus says Yahweh, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am Yahweh your God, who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the way you should go. If only you had paid attention to my commandments, then your well-being would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your descendants would have been like sand, and your offspring like its grains. Their name would never be cut off or destroyed from my presence. Then here's the command, verse 20. Go forth from Babylon. Flee from the Chaldeans. Declare with a sound of joyful shouting. Proclaim this. Send it out to the ends of the earth, saying, Yahweh has redeemed his servant Jacob. Here's the command. You're redeemed from Babylon. Go forth. That's what God says he will do for his people. They did not thirst when he led them through the deserts. He made the water flow out of the rock for them. He split the rock and the water gushed forth. These all happened when he brought deliverance to them in Egypt, when he redeemed them from the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 22, there is no peace for the wicked, says Yahweh. I like the way that ends there. Those are chapters, again, very similar to the context we looked in the last segments. But I'd like to take the time now with you and begin to look at this whole topic of Babylon as it is in the Scriptures, because I think it's a very important, it's important for us to understand as far as understanding future prophecy also. So let's take now time and consider Babylon. I have in your notes a timeline. I'll be kind of going through this. You have a page of a timeline, and then you have another page. I think the next one says Babylonian gods. We're going to kind of go through these. I'll use the timeline kind of as a way to go through this, but then we'll be going back and forth about these different gods of Babylon, looking up scriptures, and to just get an understanding of this prophecy of Babylon. And it's important in the scripture. On this timeline, I put the column that says approximate dates. That's because I keep going through these dates, looking at what people say, and you know, these are just reference. I mean, there's so many different dates on these things trying to put. I'm just giving this to you so you get some idea of a context of an approximate time period so you can see when the biblical record happened in light of what was happening with the nation of Babylon and the world at the time. Don't take the dates for any more than that. It's just as a basic reference of understanding. So turn now to Genesis chapter 10. Let's look at the history of Babylon. Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8 starts out, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon, and Arak, and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel and Arak. Now, if you look today and you see the country named Iraq, and you look up where did that name come from, how did that country get that name, the etymology study will take you back to Iraq. This is where the country that we know as Iraq got its name, way back here from this named Iraq. Babylon and Iraq are used simultaneously as these cities that Nimrod built. And I think all of us are aware what was Babel was the Tower of Babel, right? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But before I discuss that, I'd like you to turn to Joshua. That was somewhere between 2300, 2200 BC. I'm putting an approximate date of Nimrod, which would have been the Tower of Babel. Abraham comes on the scene a few hundred years later. Abraham also was from this part of the world. He was from Ur of the Chaldees. He was from the other side of the Euphrates River, right? This is where he came from. Joshua chapter 24. Joshua 24:2. I think you're familiar with this, but I wanted to read it with all of us here in case some of you hadn't seen this before. Joshua 24, verse 2. And Joshua said to the people, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river. That's the river Euphrates. Namely, Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. I really believe, as we talked last week, and I think we saw that verse in Isaiah 43:27, our first forefathers sinned, I think this is what it's talking about. He was part of this Babylonian, Mesopotamian gods. It's what he came out of. Until he was 70 years old. You know, have any of us even, you know, we're close to that, right? Any of us reached that age? That's a long time that he worshiped these gods. And then finally, when he was 70, God called him out of that. And his whole life changed. He now followed the one true God. But first, he sinned. He was part of this idolatry of Babylon. And then that other verse in Isaiah talked about the prophets of that day and time were leading people into idolatry through their words. So I think that's really what that's talking about. And this was, he left the gods of Mesopotamia. Now, I know with the Tower of Babel, we understand that Babylon was the first country, the first, governmental rule, the first major city, the first one world government, right, that was being built. It also is the first religion, the first idolatry ever brought in after the flood came through Babylon. It came from these gods of Mesopotamia under this Nimrod. Now, let's look at this. Now, if you have your thing on the Babylonian gods on the next page. I want to talk a little about these gods because we'll follow along and we'll do these as we go through the timeline. Through the years, of what I can tell, there were over 2,000 different deities worshipped in the region of Babylon and Mesopotamia. That's a lot of gods. So I just want to emphasize a few of the major ones. And some of these, they kind of interchange with names, and they have several different names they think were the same one. But they were very into the stars and planets. And so the moon and the sun and the major 5 planets were identified with these major gods of the Babylonian pantheon. And here are some of these gods. And first I'm going to look at this one called Sin-Nana. He's called Sin, he's called Nana. Nana, he's associated with the moon. Sin is the moon god, and Nana represents him in a full moon state. So Sin-Nana is the ancient Sumerian god which had ancient temples from Ur of the Chaldees in the south to Ashur in northern Mesopotamia. These temples to Sin-Nana. It is the world's earliest religion. This is where idolatry, worship of other gods began. Sin-Nana was considered the chief of the gods. And together with Shamash, who's the god of the sun, and Ishtar, the goddess of nature, life-giving force of the earth, they formed the early Babylonian triad. The first trinity came here. He was considered of primary importance in the science of astronomy and the practice of astrology. And this was big, and we even saw references that we just read of, the references to the stargazers and those who predict, and the astrologers. If you remember at the time of Daniel, right, the wise men of Israel were the astronomers, the astrologers. They were the wise men. These were the ones that were the head of wisdom and knowledge were these stargazers. The Tower of Babel and these different temples were to this god, probably, most likely to this god, Sin-Nana, and all the gods associated with him. In Genesis 11:4, with the Tower of Babel, it said that they were building a tower that would reach into heaven, right? I have here, I was supposed to show the slides for all you people following on the, this is our timeline. I'll be going back to this though, so we'll get it in the video for you guys watching the timeline here. But this is a ziggurat dedicated to the Mesopotamian god Sin-Nana that was in Ur of the Chaldeans. Where was Abraham from? That's where he's from. Ur of the Chaldeans. The typical Mesopotamian temple tower, known as a ziggurat, was square at the base and had sloping stepped sides that led upward to a small shrine at the top. They would reach into heaven. Other Mesopotamian ziggurats were given names demonstrating that they too were meant to serve as staircases from earth to heaven. The house of the link between heaven and earth at Larsa, the house of the seven guides of heaven and earth at Borsippa, the house of the foundation and platform for the heaven and earth at Babylon, the house of the mountain of the universe at Ashur, and here the ziggurat at Ur was dedicated to the moon god Sinana. These were the gods that were worshipped by Abraham and his father in Ur of the Chaldees. This is what the ziggurat is. So, that's a little bit about Abraham. Now let's go back in our chart. We'll come down here now to the first real growth of the Babylonian Empire. The ancient Babylonian Empire came under Hammurabi around 1800 to 1700 BC. And here I have, which actually this gives you a map, just shows you the whole region here, of Hammurabi's Babylon. And here in the south there by the Persian Gulf is Ur of the Chaldees. You see the pink area or orange area in the middle, that's the area of Babylon centered. The city way to the north is Ashur. All these had these temples for these gods. And this is Hammurabi's Babylon, which was in the ancient world. That was when Babylon first reached out under Hammurabi around those times. After the death of Hammurabi, though, the influence of Babylon kind of declined of that region. And it was over 1,000 years where it wasn't really that influential. So then we come to Isaiah, what we're reading here. Now, we're 1,000 years after. Babylon really hasn't come back to its prominence that it had since Hammurabi. And Isaiah, I put down that he was somewhere between, let me see on the chart here, he was somewhere between 760 BC and 670 BC was probably, I gave as a range when Isaiah lived and when he wrote what we read here in Isaiah. All right? At this time when Isaiah wrote, Babylon had still not yet gone back to the influence it had under Hammurabi. It still wasn't the great Babylon of past. It was still under Assyrian control. It had kings, there were kings of Babylon, but they were under the control of the Assyrians at the time that Isaiah wrote the things that we are reading. All right? Around 625 to 605 BC, Nabopolassar, Babylon defeated the Assyrians. And then Babylon became over Assyria, took over the Assyrian Empire. And then here on the chart, sometime between 605 and 560 BC is this reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And under Nebuchadnezzar became the height of the Babylonian Empire. This was Babylon the Great. This was when Babylon was in its glory. This is the time that happens around 100 years after what we're reading here in Isaiah. And it is at that time when Judah is taken into captivity, into Babylon, and Babylon has reached its greatness. And truly, under Nebuchadnezzar and under the greatness of this time of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian gods were still quite prominent in Babylon. The next god I want to show you, I talked about Shamash, which is associated with the sun, but during the time of Nebuchadnezzar now, this god was the chief god, Bel-Marduk. Bel really is a term for Lord, but sometimes Marduk is referred to by Bel and Marduk. He's associated with the planet Jupiter, and he is the Lord of the gods. During the later Babylonian rule, the time we are with Nebuchadnezzar, Bel-Marduk became the main god of the Babylonian pantheon. And he is supposedly is the god of magic and sorceries. And he used his abilities to seize power over all the other gods. This is Bel Marduk. And one of his associates is this god, Nebo or Nabu. Nebo, Nabu. He's associated with the planet Mercury. He was the god of writing and wisdom. So you have writing, wisdom, sorceries, astrology. I think of Babylon. This was the god of writing and wisdom and knowledge. And supposedly he had power over humans. It is said that he could engrave the destiny of each person on his tablets of sacred record. There in this little picture is him with his tablet of sacred record, Nabu. At the time of Isaiah and later Neo-Babylonian Empire Nebuchadnezzar, these two gods, Bel and Nabu, or Marduk and Nabu, were of primary importance in Babylonian lore. Remember when we read in chapter 46 of 1? Isaiah named these two gods by name, Bel and Nebo. That those two gods, you two gods are going down. They were the gods, these are the primary gods ruling the wisdom and the sorceries and of Babylon and where they supposedly get their power from. It's interesting, I checked some historical things. It's also interesting to note that these two are mentioned in non-biblical historical works. One of these is a tablet called the Chronicle of Nabonidus, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And these gods are named there as moving around the country of Babylon. Bel and they're named together. Also, there is a clay, it's like a clay pot called the cylinder of Cyrus, the Cyrus cylinder. And in this cylinder, talking about Cyrus coming in to take over the land, he talks about freeing the gods Nebo and the god Bel Marduk in the Cyrus cylinder. So these were, it's not just a biblical reference, these are the references in history, in the Bible. These two gods are mentioned by name. Two other gods, which I'm not going to talk too much about, is Ninurta was associated with the planet Saturn. He was the god of war, and Nergal is associated with the planet Mars. He was the god of the underworld. Now, Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. Isn't she beautiful? Ishtar was queen of the night. She's associated with the planet Venus. Venus, the god of love. She was the goddess of love and fertility, and above all, associated with sexuality. Her cult involved sacred prostitution. She was the great whore of Babylon, the mother goddess, queen of the nations, seducing gods, nations, and mankind to her control. That's what Ishtar was known for. And Nebuchadnezzar and his father, Nabopolassar, gave great tribute to this goddess, Ishtar. And they built the famous Ishtar Gate, which is dedicated to the goddess Ishtar. It was part of the Great Wall of Babylon, and some have said that this Wall of Babylon and the Ishtar Gate was part of the great seven wonders of the world originally, but also the gardens of Babylon were part of that, and so this was replaced with the lighthouse of So, but this was a big deal. Now, the picture you're looking at here is a replica of the Ishtar Gate. And you guys remember taking the Revelation class? Remember when we learned about Pergamum? And that in Berlin, they had the Museum of Pergamum, and they built an entire temple of the Temple of Pergamum in Berlin and brought it there. In this museum, they also built this. Well, I don't know what's up with that. I don't get that in Berlin. But they have the Temple of Pergamum. So if you want to go look at these things, go to Berlin and visit. And they built a replica, a full-size replica of the Ishtar Gate at the Babylon here at Pergamum. But this was in worship of Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar Gate was the main entrance into the city. Now, this is a model that's from this. This is a model in this Pergamum Museum. Beyond the gate Ishtar was this area called the Processional Way. The Processional Way. And this Ishtar Gate was the main entrance into the city of Babylon. So you would come through the Ishtar Gate, and then you would come down the Processional Way. And the statues of deities were paraded through the gate down the Processional Way each year during the New Year's celebration. Now, some have said that this gate was built during the time of Nabopolassar. Some say Nebuchadnezzar built it. I'm not certain. But imagine the Jewish people being brought into captivity. Here, you wanted to worship other gods? Here you go, Israel. Here are your gods. And basically that's what God did. Brought them to Babylon and said, here you are. Welcome to the home of idolatry. Coming into this time. So, that's the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar kind of got full of himself, probably walking along these walls of Babylon one day and says, look at this Babylon that I have built. And then, boop, went crazy and went into the wilderness for 7 years, remember? God taught him a lesson, and he said, oh, I know who God is. And then, in Daniel, you can read about his grandson, Belshazzar. Belshazzar got a little full of himself. Nebuchadnezzar's son was Nabonidus. Nabonidus' son was Belshazzar. He got a little full of himself. And they brought all the gold and the instruments from the temple of Jerusalem, Yahweh's temple, brought them in and had a big party. And that party was to the gods of Babylon, using implements from Yahweh's temple. And then you have the writing on the wall. And they couldn't read it. And Daniel was called in. And it was funny, they called Daniel what the Babylonians called him. They said that the spirit of the gods are in him. No. The spirit of the God was in Daniel. And Daniel reads the writing on the wall, says, you guys are worshiping these gods, and you are making disgrace to our God. You are weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom is given over to the Persians and the Medes. And that night, under the command of Cyrus was in charge. The Bible uses the word Darius. There's different questions about what that is, but we know historically Cyrus was over the Persian Empire, and the Persians defeated the Babylonians that night. Now, it's interesting. They defeated the Persians, but Cyrus, if you follow the history of Cyrus, Cyrus was into religious freedom. He was a very contemporary leader of our day and time. He sent the Jews back to Jerusalem and let them worship their God. He freed the gods of Babylon. He said the Babylonians were keeping them and so they could worship these temples to all these gods. He didn't destroy the gods of Babylon. He allowed them to continue and allowed the gods of all the nations to continue. That was the type of ruler that Cyrus was. And although the Babylonians were defeated, the city of Babylon wasn't defeated that night. In fact, the city of Babylon becomes one of the administrative hubs of the Persian Empire. The city didn't get destroyed that night. It changed hands from the Babylonians to the Persians under King Cyrus. And that was for a few hundred years. Around 350 to 325 BC, Alexander the Great, the Greeks come in, right? And they defeat the Persians. Do you know where Alexander the Great died? Babylon. He died in Babylon. And then in Babylon, in the temple of Nebuchadnezzar, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom of the Greeks was divided among the generals that happened in Babylon. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, that the Grecian Empire was divided up the kingdoms. That was administrated from Babylon. All right? But after this time, the Grecians, they fought, there was inner fighting among all the different generals and whoever had control over Babylon, I think kind of just went into disarray because there's no real discussion about Babylon from this time in history, and it slowly went into decay. And after decades, probably for a few hundred years of infighting, the city of Babylon declined to desolation and obscurity. By 140 BC, they say Babylon was no more. Nobody lived there. It was gone. Just left. And that's how Babylon went. And it just slowly rotted away. Slowly through, the air and through rain and all the things, it just fell to pieces. You see, Cyrus did not destroy the gods of Babylon, but rather he freed them, allowing religious freedom in the Persian Empire. The city of Babylon continued to flourish and was of importance until after the death of Alexander the Great. And the city eventually declined to desolation and obscurity. Now I'd like you to look at Isaiah 13. This was a prophecy that Isaiah had earlier in the first part of the book of Isaiah about the devastation that was going to come upon Babylon. Isaiah 13 and in verse 19. It says, "And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of Chaldeans' pride, the city of Babylon will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. Nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, nor will shepherds make their flocks lie down there. But desert creatures will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches also will live there, and shaggy goats, or goat demons, or satyrs, in the King James, I believe, will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her fateful time also will come soon, and her days will not be prolonged." I have a picture that was taken in 1932 of Babylon. There it is. From the time when Alexander's generals took over, it just deteriorated. And 2,000 years it sat with nobody there. And in 1932, that is Babylon. That was it. That was Babylon. You can look at that. In the back I have memoirs that were written by a man called Claudius James Rich, Esquire of London, in 1818. I don't know who he was. I don't know if he was an archaeologist. I don't know if he was, but he went to, he thought he was going to go find the ruins of Babylon and discover something great. And this is his description of what he found in 1818 when he was trying to find Babylon. And I'll read just a few of this a little bit with you. And you can look at the picture up here too. I thought I should have distinguished some traces, however imperfect, of many of the principal structures of Babylon. I imagined I should have said, "Here are the walls, and such must have been the extent of the area. There stood the palace, and this most assuredly was the power of Belus." I was completely deceived. Instead of a few insulated mounds, I found the whole face of the country covered with just vestiges of buildings, in some places of brick walls, surprisingly fresh, and others merely of a vast succession of mounds of rubbish, of such indeterminate figures, variety, and extent as to involve the person who should have formed any theory in inextricable confusion. This, together with the impossibility in such a remote situation of referring to all the authorities I should have consulted, will cause my account of the remains of Babylon to appear very meager and unsatisfactory. I thought I'd find something cool. I found rubbish. I found nothing. On the fourth paragraph down there, he says, on the ruins of Babylon, there is not a single tree growing, except the old one, which I shall hereafter occasion to mention. It is an everlasting green. I believe not common in this part of the country, though I am told there is a tree of same description at Basra. All the people of the country assert that it is extremely dangerous to approach this mound after nightfall on account of the multitude of evil spirits by which it is haunted. There are many dens of wild beasts in various parts. In one of them, which I found the bones of sheep and other animals, and perceived a strong smell like that of a lion. I also found quantities of porcupine quills, and in most of the cavities are numbers of bats and owls. It is a curious coincidence that I first here heard of the Oriental account of satyrs. I had always imagined the belief of their existence was confined to the mythology of the West, but a Chodar who was with me when I examined this ruin mentioned by accident that in this desert an animal was found resembling a man from head to waist, but having the thighs of legs of a sheep or a goat. They had myths of this goat, shaggy goat, that was dwelling among the... So that was in 1818. I don't think it increased too much by 1932. So, now turn to Revelation. At the time of the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Revelation, Babylon was no more. It was gone. So either the references that we read here in Revelation to Babylon is either metaphorical or the city of Babylon is going to rise again. For over 2,000 years, this area known as Babylon has sat in desolation. But the Apostle John, receiving prophecy from the one who was, who is to come, who can tell things that are going to happen before they happen, tells of a future devastation of Babylon. Revelation 18. Revelation 18. And I'll just read through this quickly. We read this in the Revelation class, but Revelation 18, verse 2. He cried with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit, a prison for every unclean and hateful bird. All the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. The kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins. Verse 6, Pay her back even as she has been paid. Give back to her double according to her deeds in the cup which she has mixed twice as much for her. Verse 7, To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. This sit as a queen and I'm a widow is a reference back to what we read in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 8 and 9. For this reason, in one day her plagues will come. Look at verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing in the distance because of the fear of her torment. Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. Verse 17. For in 1 hour great wealth has been laid waste, and every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, and as many as making their living by the sea, stood at a distance, and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Here, which is what it was talked about in Isaiah, that in 1 hour, 1 day, she would be defeated. Here it talks about the city burning down. Original Babylon didn't burn down. Original Babylon just wasted away over years. This talks about a Babylon that's going to burn in 1 hour. She's going to burn up. So, what's John talking about? Is Babylon simply metaphorical, representing the systems and the kingdoms of this world? Now, I first got into the Bible and started studying things in the 1970s. And I can tell you in 1970, from what I discussed and what I read, that Babylon was thought of to be metaphorical, representing the systems, kingdoms, and religions of this world. Many thought it was the Roman Catholic Church. Others thought it was, some thought it was the United States. You know, it was some governmental power that represented the influence of the original Babylon. That's what I first thought when I heard these things. The idea of a rebuilt Babylon was just ludicrous. Look at, see, look, take a look at this. It's the last chance you're going to get a look at the devastation, okay? Because I'm going to show you a video here in a minute. So look at the slide there. That was Babylon in 1932. It had sat that way for 2,000 years, okay? The idea of a resurgent Babylon was ludicrous. You can start getting the video ready, Brad. Then in 1980s, Saddam Hussein tried to, can you just put it in pause it? So, okay. He tried to, he tried to rebuild part of Babylon. Matter of fact, he tried to put himself on par with Nebuchadnezzar. He kind of thought a little high of himself. Of course, we know what happened to Saddam Hussein. 2 Gulf Wars later, he was defeated and tried and executed. So there ends Saddam and his, and that's the last I'd really heard of, so I'd heard about that. Kind of again, well, I just decided to take a look at this, and now I'm going to show you a video. This is not done by Doomsday Prophets. This is not a video. This is a video from the New York Times. This is what's happening right now in our world with the restoration of Babylon. So go ahead and play it, Brad. Remember the picture before that you saw of what it was in 1932. Well, there we go. We'll start it over again. Is it going? We practiced it. It worked. Here we go.
We can see here, and if we test, there is a big quantity of salt inside the bricks.
It's been 7 years since the war began in Iraq, and for the first time, you're beginning to see work again in places like Babylon behind me and other archaeological sites around the country.
Babylon, the ancient capital of King Nebuchadnezzar, is easily the most famous of Iraq's historic sites. Over the millennia, it has suffered damage from time and nature, and from Saddam-era reconstruction in the 1980s that put new walls and palaces on top of the old ruins.
See exactly the line between the original wall and the part rebuilt or reconstructed during the 18th.
And more recently, the damage from coalition forces who dug trenches while using it as a base after 2003. As workers begin refurbishing the museum and a replica of Ishtar Gate, A much harder task is to stop things getting worse. Only then can they start making them better.
What you need first to do is to create documentation to understand what's wrong and what are the problems with the monument. Look at this is all modern masonry, all this back here.
The World Monuments Fund completed a survey and last month received $2 million from the United States government to begin restoration work.
In this guidebook from the 1980s, we have a picture before the restoration work during the Saddam period. And so what you see in the background here are the reconstructed bays and crenellations of the processional way as envisioned by the people within the Antiquities Department in the 1980s.
Fundamentally, how many of the problems you face are man-made and how many are natural?
Well, I think that if we just had to deal with one or the other, it would be fine. But the two together is nearly toxic for the preservation of monuments.
Beyond Babylon, Iraq is rich in cultural heritage. According to tradition, Old Testament prophets are buried here. In Kirkuk, Daniel. In the far north, Nahum, near ancient Nineveh. And only a few miles from Babylon, the tomb of Ezekiel. In Kifl, a minaret is being restored. In the ancient Kurdish city of Erbil, the citadel in the center of town is undergoing extensive repairs as part of an effort to create a site tourists will someday visit. Not far from Baghdad, the ancient palace in Ctesiphon is in danger of falling down.
This site fell down at 1887 AD.
And is it in danger of falling now?
We think it's very dangerous. We found many bricks fall down from the arch, from the top.
West of Baghdad is a ziggurat, Akar Kuf, that's as old as what you see in Babylon today. For the first time in years, people feel safe to visit again.
Egypt has been benefiting from its ruins for 50 years. Why can't we benefit from our history?
Iraqi officials want more visitors at places like Babylon. They hope to make it a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That may mean undoing some of Saddam Hussein's renovations in the 1980s.
The fundamental point is the authenticity and the integrity of the monument in Babylon. So we are obliged in the conservation plan to remove part of the buildings which was reconstructed and restored in 1980.
The work at these sites has only just begun, and no one thinks it'll be easy.
Past presidents in Iraq would suggest that it's difficult to predict and say, we will do this in 5 years or that in 10 years. To do that would be somewhat naive. At the same time, we're going to try our best with the circumstances given us to produce results here.
Babylon rises again. In the New York Times article in January 2011 called "A Triage to Save the Ruins of Babylon," the New York, and he mentioned this in there, that the State Department gave a $2 million grant to begin work to preserve the site's most impressive surviving ruins. The objective is to prepare the site and other ruins from Ur in the south, that ziggurat, Ur of the Chaldees, Tower of Babel style ziggurat, rebuild it, for what officials hope will someday be a flood of scientists, scholars, and tourists that could contribute to Iraq's economic revival almost as much as oil. So the reconstruction of Babylon is now being supported by the United States of America, not just Saddam Hussein by himself. Incidentally, last night were the presidential debates on foreign policy. And you know what amazed me? Is almost all of the foreign policy was all about the Middle East. Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a lot more to the world than just that location, but that's all we're concerned about. And both parties, if you listen to the platform of what both men said, one of the things that both agree on is the way that we need to deal with the Middle East is to help the economic development of the Arab countries. Doesn't matter who's going to get elected. That is the policy of both sides. We had a $17 trillion debt. I got an area where you could cut. Maybe we could start there. Let's send our money to build Babylon. So, like I say, in the 1970s, I would never have even thought that the prophecy in Revelation could literally be a restored city of Babylon. But God, who was, who is, and who is to come, has declared things before they come to pass. If this is the beginning of a rebirth of Babylon, it was long ago foretold. But so was the deliverance. Remember Isaiah 48. Go forth from Babylon. Flee from the Chaldeans. Declare with the sound of joyful shouting. Proclaim this. Send it out to the ends of the earth. Say, Yahweh has redeemed his servant Jacob. There is him whom Yahweh has called that will be successful. In the past, Cyrus was his shepherd, his anointed to subdue Babylon. Now in Isaiah, in the next several chapters, we are really going to begin to really get into much detail about the servant of Yahweh that is going to come. And we'll look at this after the break.